The ballroom of the Stonewell Tower glittered under 1,000 crystals of light, and the orchestra played something slow and expensive, the kind of music that only existed in rooms where everyone wore more money than most people would see in a lifetime. Then the doors opened, and a man, in a worn, faded suit walked in, holding nothing but a leather wallet he had found on the street. Every eye in the room turned toward him with open contempt. Security moved to throw him out before he could take a single step further. That was when the most beautiful heiress in the city broke through the crowd, her heels echoing against marble, her eyes already filling with tears she could not explain to anyone watching. She took his face in both hands, as if she were afraid he might vanish if she let go. "I found you," she whispered, loud enough for the cameras to catch every syllable. Then, in front of hundreds of business leaders and a wall of flashing lenses, she kissed the poor man the entire room had just tried to remove. The silence that followed was the kind that swallowed an entire building. No one in that ballroom knew she had spent 7 years searching for exactly this moment. Ethan Carter had never wanted to be looked at. And for 38 years, that had mostly worked out fine for him. He repaired industrial machines for a living, the kind of work that left grease under his fingernails and rarely earned him a second glance from anyone who mattered. His income was modest, his apartment smaller than most people's garages, but he paid every bill on time and never once let his quiet life turn bitter. He spoke little, boasted about nothing, and carried himself like a man who had already decided the world owed him no explanations. There had been a time, many years earlier, when he believed in love the way other people believed in luck, as something that might still find him if he waited long enough. A loss he rarely spoke of had closed that door quietly, without drama, the way doors close in houses where no one is left to walk through them. Since then, Ethan had built a life out of small, dependable things. A steady job, a clean conscience, evenings alone that he had stopped calling lonely. He did not search for anything more than that, and he certainly never expected anything to find him. His neighbors knew him as the quiet man 2 floors up who fixed their dripping faucets for free and never once mentioned it again afterward. Children on his street called him by name because he always remembered theirs, though most adults barely registered him at all beyond a polite nod in passing. He kept a single framed photograph on a shelf, faded at the corners, of a life he no longer spoke about to anyone, and he had long since stopped expecting that to change. Routine had become a kind of shelter for him, predictable and undemanding. The only thing in his life he could fully control. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening when he found the wallet lying near a service entrance behind one of the city's tallest hotels, dropped, it seemed, in a hurry by someone who never looked back. He almost walked past it, the way anyone does with the small accidents of strangers' lives. But something made him crouch down and pick it up instead. Inside was a world entirely foreign to his own. A black metal card thicker and heavier than anything he had ever held. A passport bearing a name he did not recognize, an old necklace wrapped carefully in tissue, and a gold-embossed invitation to the Stonewell Gala that very night. He tried calling the only number listed inside, again and again, but no one ever answered. A man with less patience might have simply left the wallet at the front desk and walked away, content with having done the bare minimum. Ethan was not that kind of man, he decided, with the same quiet stubbornness that defined everything else about him, that he would deliver it himself, in person, to whoever was waiting for it inside that glowing tower of marble and light. He told himself it was simply the responsible thing to do, the kind of small decency that cost him nothing but an evening he would have otherwise spent alone. He changed into the only suit he owned, pressed years earlier for a funeral he still did not like remembering, and took 2 trains across the city to reach the address printed on the invitation. He had no expectation of thanks, no interest in being noticed, only a quiet intention to hand the wallet to its owner and disappear back into his own unremarkable evening. He had no way of knowing that the building he was walking toward held the one person who had spent 7 winters wondering whether he still existed at all. The moment he stepped through the hotel doors, the room seemed to recoil from him as if he carried something contagious. 2 security guards blocked his path before he had taken 3 steps, their hands already reaching for his arm. Guests glanced over with thinly disguised disgust, murmuring about catering staff who had wandered somewhere they did not belong. One woman in a shimmering green gown looked him over from head to toe and did not bother to lower her voice. "Does someone like you even know what kind of place this is?" she said, loud enough for the small circle around her to laugh. Ethan said nothing in response. He did not raise his voice, did not explain himself, did not reach for the easy anger that most people would have grabbed onto in his place. He simply held the wallet a little tighter, waiting for someone, anyone, willing to listen for 10 seconds longer than the rest of the room seemed capable of giving him. The guards tightened their grip, ready to march him back out into the night, exactly as they had planned from the moment they saw him. A man near the bar lifted his phone to film the spectacle, clearly more interested in the entertainment than in what Ethan was actually trying to do. Someone else suggested, half joking, that perhaps he had wandered in hoping to steal something, since people like him rarely had any other reason to be standing in a room like this one. Ethan kept his eyes forward, his expression unreadable. The same calm he had once needed to survive far harder nights than this one. He had learned long ago that explaining himself to people who had already decided what he was rarely changed anything at all. That was when a long black car pulled up outside the glass doors, and the chatter inside the ballroom shifted, quieter now, more attentive. The way a room changes when something important is about to happen. Every head turned toward the entrance. A woman stepped out of the car into the golden light pouring from the lobby. And for reasons the room would not understand until much later, the night was about to be rewritten entirely. Victoria Stone had spent 34 years becoming exactly the kind of woman tabloids loved to write about and feared to provoke. She was the sole heir to Stonewell Industries, a company her family had built across 3 generations of careful ambition. And she had inherited not just its fortune, but its sharp, calculating instincts. People who worked with her described her as brilliant, composed, and utterly impossible to read. There had never been a single scandal attached to her name, not one leaked photo, not one whispered affair, nothing the press could ever sink its teeth into. Beneath that polished exterior was a woman who had not allowed herself to love anyone in 7 years, not because she lacked the capacity, but because she had never stopped looking for someone the rest of the world insisted did not exist. Colleagues assumed her solitude was simply the price of ambition, the natural result of a woman too busy building an empire to bother with romance. None of them knew that somewhere beneath every merger and every board meeting, she carried a memory she had never once managed to set down. She had been offered, over the years, every introduction her social circle could arrange. Sons of senators, heirs to shipping fortunes, men who looked perfect on paper and felt like nothing at all in person. She turned down each one politely, citing work, citing timing, citing anything other than the truth she rarely admitted, even to herself. Her closest assistant, a sharp young woman named Claire, who had worked beside her for nearly 5 years, was the only person who knew about the necklace Victoria kept locked in a drawer of her office desk. Even Claire had stopped asking questions about it long ago, having learned that some subjects simply remained closed, no matter how gently she approached them. She entered the gala that evening exactly as she always did, with the practiced calm of someone who had learned to walk into any room and own it instantly. Then her gaze drifted toward the small commotion near the entrance, toward a man in a faded suit being restrained by 2 guards twice his size, and something in her chest seized so violently that the wallet she had been holding in her own hand slipped from her fingers and hit the floor. She did not move for several seconds, frozen in place while the rest of the room continued its meaningless conversations around her. Her eyes had gone glassy, rimmed with a redness that no makeup could explain away. Nobody standing near her understood what was happening, only that the unshakable Victoria Stone, the woman who had once negotiated a hostile takeover without blinking, suddenly looked like she might collapse. Then she ran. Heads turned as she pushed past stunned guests, her gown trailing behind her. Every step carrying 7 years of searching toward a man who had no idea he was the reason for any of it. The crowd assumed she was furious, that she intended to publicly shame the intruder who had dared to wander into her family's gala. Instead, when she reached him, she did the one thing nobody in that ballroom could have predicted. She wrapped her arms around him and held on, as if letting go even once might cost her everything a second time. "I found you," she said again, her voice breaking apart on every word. Then she kissed him, slowly, deliberately, in front of every camera, every reporter, every shareholder who had ever doubted her judgment. The ballroom fell into a silence so complete that the orchestra forgot to keep playing. Phones rose into the air on instinct, capturing a moment none of them yet understood. while Victoria Stone stood there holding a stranger as though he were the only solid thing left in a world that had just tilted sideways beneath her feet. Ethan stepped back first, gently but firmly, his confusion plain on his face for everyone to see. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I think you have the wrong person." What none of them understood, not the guards, not the guests, not even Ethan himself in that moment, was that Victoria had not made a single mistake. 7 years earlier, in a winter so brutal that rescue teams had eventually called off the search, she had been hiking alone through a remote mountain range when the trail beneath her gave way without warning. She fell hard, lost her radio in the snow, and lay there for hours believing, with a calm that frightened her more than the pain did, that she was simply going to die quietly in the cold. A maintenance technician working on a nearby relay station had heard something faint carried on the wind and gone to investigate against his own better judgment. He found her half-buried, barely conscious, and carried her back to the only shelter he had, a small cabin meant for storing equipment, not for housing a stranger fighting to stay alive. For 3 days, he kept her warm, fed her what little food he had, and watched over her through a storm that made any rescue attempt impossible. The cabin had no heat beyond a small portable stove, and whatever blankets he could find stacked in a supply closet meant for machine parts, not people. He stayed awake most of the first night checking her breathing, terrified that the cold had already done more damage than either of them could see. By the second day, she had regained enough strength to speak in full sentences, and they talked for hours about nothing important, the kind of conversation that exists only between two people who do not expect to see each other again. He told her, without elaborating, that he had lost someone once and had not let himself get close to anyone since. And she remembered that confession long after she had forgotten the exact sound of the storm outside. He never asked her name, and she never offered it, not because either of them wanted secrecy, but because survival had simply left no room for formality. When the weather finally broke and a search party's lights appeared in the distance, he slipped away before they arrived, quietly. The way he did everything, without waiting for thanks or recognition or anything at all. He never knew the woman he saved would one day run a company with his own name etched somewhere into a debt she could never fully repay. All Victoria carried away from those 3 days was a first name, a worn silver necklace he had pressed into her hand before disappearing into the storm, and the memory of a smile that had somehow made dying feel less frightening. In the years that followed, she hired investigators, quietly, persistently, spending more money chasing a single name than most companies spent on entire departments. Every lead dissolved into nothing. Every winter that passed without an answer convinced her a little more that she might never find him at all. She kept a folder, thick with dead ends, in the bottom drawer of her desk. Maintenance logs that led nowhere. Technicians who shared his first name but not his face. Dead phone numbers and abandoned addresses scattered across half the country. One investigator, after 2 years of fruitless searching, gently suggested that perhaps it was time to let the matter rest, that some people simply vanish from the world without leaving enough behind to be found again. Victoria fired him within the week and hired someone new, unwilling to accept that a man who had once given her every reason to keep living could simply cease to exist on paper. She never told anyone, not even Claire, how many nights she had spent staring at that necklace, wondering if she had imagined more of those 3 days than had actually happened. "I haven't thought about that in a long time," Ethan said carefully, still trying to understand why a stranger's face had just come undone in front of him. He had told himself the truth, mostly. The memory of a stranger he had once carried through a storm had faded into something distant, a story he barely told because there had never seemed to be a point in telling it. He had no idea the woman standing in front of him in diamonds and silk was the same person he had once wrapped in his only blanket, half convinced she would not survive the night. By morning, the kiss had already become the only story anyone in the city wanted to discuss. Photographs spread across every screen, accompanied by furious commentary from board members who treated the gala as a sacred ceremony rather than a party. Shareholders called emergency meetings before the sun had fully risen, demanding to know why the face of Stonewell Industries had just kissed a man who looked, by every visible measure, like he could not afford the suit he was almost wearing. Financial analysts speculated openly about how the incident might affect the company. Several longtime board members, men who had known her since she was a teenager learning the family business, expressed open disappointment, suggesting she had embarrassed not only herself but everyone who had ever vouched for her judgment. Reporters camped outside her apartment building for 2 straight days, hoping to catch some unguarded moment that would explain what they were all calling, in increasingly dramatic headlines, "The Heiress" and "The Stranger." Victoria ignored every one of them, refusing to issue a statement, refusing to apologize for a moment she had waited 7 years to live. Richard Stone, the man who had raised Victoria since childhood and groomed her for exactly this role, summoned her into his office before she had even managed to remove her makeup from the night before. "You will destroy everything this family built," he told her, his voice low and controlled in the way that frightened people far more than shouting ever could. Victoria did not flinch. "If it weren't for him," she said, "I would have died on that mountain, and none of this would exist for either of us to argue about." Richard studied her for a long moment, the anger in his expression slowly giving way to something closer to exhaustion. He had built his entire career on controlling outcomes, on never letting emotion interfere with decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions in shareholder value. Watching his daughter choose a stranger over the carefully constructed image he had spent decades protecting felt, to him, like watching the foundation of everything he understood quietly crack apart. Meanwhile, across the city, Ethan had already decided the simplest solution was to disappear from her life as quickly as he had stumbled into it. He had not asked for any of this: the cameras, the headlines, the sudden attention from people who had spent the previous evening looking at him like something to be scraped off the floor. He told himself it was the right thing to do, the kind thing, sparing her a scandal she had not actually chosen, and he had never intended to cause. He was halfway out the door of the small cafe where she had asked to meet him when her hand closed around his wrist, firmer than he expected, from someone so carefully composed in every photograph he had ever seen of her. "Not this time," she said. "I won't let you disappear on me again." The weeks that followed tested every assumption Ethan had built his life around. Victoria pursued him with a quiet persistence that had nothing in common with the calculated image the press had constructed of her, showing up not with extravagant gifts, but with simple, ordinary requests, asking to share a meal at the kind of diner that had never once hosted a Stone family member. He refused her more often than he accepted, convinced that the gap between their worlds was simply too wide to cross without someone getting badly hurt. He told himself she deserved someone who matched the life she had been raised into, not a man who fixed broken machines for a living and counted every dollar before spending it. He worried, more than he admitted aloud, about how it would look, a poor man suddenly attached to one of the wealthiest women in the city, the easy assumption everyone would make about his motives. Victoria, for her part, seemed entirely unbothered by what anyone assumed, as if 7 years of searching had burned away her patience for other people's opinions. She began stepping, deliberately, into the kind of life she had never been permitted to live. They ate at a noodle shop with sticky tables and a television bolted crookedly to the wall, and she laughed more in that single hour than photographs of her had ever suggested she was capable of. They rode the subway together during rush hour, pressed shoulder to shoulder with strangers who had no idea who she was, and for the first time in years, she felt invisible in the best possible way. She started showing up at his apartment on weekends, carrying nothing but a bag of groceries, insisting on cooking meals neither of them could really call successful, laughing harder at the failures than she ever had at any dinner served on china worth more than his entire kitchen. He taught her, patiently and without condescension, how to change a tire and tighten a loose hinge, small skills she had never once needed in a life staffed entirely by people paid to handle such things for her. She found herself looking forward to ordinary Tuesdays in a way she had never looked forward to galas or board meetings, and that realization frightened her slightly, the way important truths sometimes do. One evening, caught in a sudden downpour with no umbrella between them, they simply kept walking instead of running for shelter, soaked through and laughing at how little it actually mattered. Victoria told him later that those ordinary, unremarkable hours were the closest thing to peace she had felt since before the accident that had changed the course of her entire life. Slowly, carefully, the walls each of them had built for entirely different reasons began to come down, brick by brick, conversation by conversation. It did not last without interruption. A man named Damian Cross arrived back in the city that same month, the son of Stonewell's largest rival, carrying with him an engagement her family had quietly arranged years earlier and never formally cancelled. He did not love Victoria, not in any way that mattered. But he understood precisely what marrying into Stonewell would mean for his own family's ambitions, and he had no intention of losing that advantage to a man who fixed machines for a living. Damien had spent the last several years overseas, expanding his father's holdings, building a reputation as a sharp, occasionally ruthless negotiator who rarely lost when money was on the table. He returned to the city expecting the engagement to simply resume where it had been left, treating Victoria less like a future wife and more like an asset he had stepped away from briefly and now intended to reclaim. The gala photographs reached him before he had even finished unpacking, and his first reaction was not jealousy but irritation, the kind reserved for an unexpected obstacle. In an otherwise straightforward transaction, he decided almost immediately that the problem was simple enough to remove, the way he removed every other inconvenience that stood between him and what he wanted. Damien's interest in Ethan began as simple curiosity and curdled quickly into obsession once he realized the man was not going anywhere. He hired investigators of his own, hoping to dig up a criminal record, a string of unpaid debts, anything that would let him discredit Ethan publicly and reclaim Victoria's attention without having to compete fairly for it. Investigation after investigation came back the same way: clean, unremarkable, frustratingly honest. When digging failed to produce results, Damien decided money would simply have to do the work instead. He arranged a private meeting at a quiet restaurant, slid a folder across the table containing the details of a transfer worth $5 million, and told Ethan, with the confidence of a man who had never once been told no by someone with so little, to simply walk away from Victoria's life and never look back. Damien spoke as though he were offering a fair business arrangement rather than a bribe, explaining in calm, measured tones that men in Ethan's position rarely got chances like this one and would be foolish to waste it on sentiment. He suggested that Ethan could disappear quietly, start over somewhere new, perhaps even open his own small repair shop with money enough left over to live comfortably for the rest of his life. He framed the offer as generous, almost charitable, the kind of gesture a powerful man extends to someone beneath him out of simple practicality. Ethan closed the folder without opening it fully and pushed it back across the table. "I'm not for sale," he said, "and neither is she." Damien's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes hardened into something colder, more deliberate, the look of a man recalculating his next move rather than accepting defeat. He stood, straightened his jacket, and delivered a promise instead of a threat, the kind of promise wealthy men make when they have never once had to follow through on consequences themselves. "I will destroy everything you have," he said quietly, "and there won't be enough of it left to matter." True to his word, the consequences arrived quickly and quietly, the way real damage usually does. Contracts Ethan had relied on for years began evaporating one after another, clients suddenly citing vague reasons for ending agreements that had run smoothly for a decade. Within a matter of weeks, the steady, modest income he had built his entire adult life around had nearly disappeared, replaced by a silence from phone calls that used to come regularly. Victoria noticed almost immediately and offered, without hesitation, to fix it the way she fixed every other problem in her life, with money, influence, a single phone call to the right person. Ethan refused just as quickly, his pride rising to the surface in a way it rarely did about anything else in his life. "I want to stand beside you on my own 2 feet, he told her. "Not because you carried me there." Victoria did not argue further, though something in her chest ached at the quiet dignity behind his refusal. Instead, an unexpected ally arrived to fill in the gaps neither of them had known existed. An older engineer named Walter Higgins, a man who had worked alongside Ethan years earlier at a manufacturing plant on the edge of the city, came forward with a story neither Victoria nor the public had ever heard before. Walter explained, in careful, measured detail, how a catastrophic equipment failure had once threatened to level an entire section of that plant, putting dozens of workers' lives in immediate danger. Ethan had been the one who diagnosed the fault in minutes, when senior engineers with decades more experience had been unable to identify the problem at all and had personally shut down the failing system at considerable risk to himself. He had asked for nothing afterward, not recognition, not a bonus, not even a mention in the incident report that followed. The story spread quickly once Walter shared it, reframing the narrative the press had been building around Ethan from something pitiable into something quietly extraordinary. Reporters who had once mocked his second-hand suit began asking different questions entirely, wondering aloud what kind of man turns down credit for saving lives and turns down $5 million in the same breath. Public opinion, fickle as always, began to shift in his favor, just as quickly as it had once turned against him. The shift could not have come at a more critical moment. Stonewell's flagship manufacturing facility, an enormous automated complex that handled nearly half the company's production, suddenly went dark without warning, every system failing simultaneously, in a way none of the company's own engineers could explain. Losses began accumulating by the millions with every hour the facility remained offline. And not a single specialist Stonewell brought in could identify the cause, let alone a solution. Executives gathered in an emergency operations room, lined with screens showing nothing but error codes and frozen production lines, voices rising as the hours ticked by without progress. Outside contractors flown in, at considerable expense, spent an entire afternoon running diagnostics that produced no usable answers, each one offering a different theory, and none of them willing to commit to a fix. Workers on the factory floor stood idle beside silent machines, watching engineers in expensive suits argue over blueprints that seemed to explain less the longer anyone studied them. The company's reputation, already fragile after weeks of unflattering headlines, could not afford another disaster layered on top of the first one. Victoria stood in the control room watching numbers climb in the wrong direction, feeling for the first time in years genuinely powerless against a problem money alone could not solve. It was Walter, again, who suggested the one name nobody else had considered. The same man who had once diagnosed an impossible failure in minutes when everyone around him had given up. Ethan arrived within the hour, said almost nothing, and went straight to work, without waiting for permission or explanation from anyone in the room. He moved through the facility with a quiet, methodical focus that left the company's own senior engineers standing in stunned silence, watching a man they had dismissed weeks earlier work through a problem none of them had been able to touch. Within a matter of hours, the entire system came back online, exactly as it had been before, as if the crisis had simply never happened. He worked through the wiring diagrams with the same unhurried calm he brought to every job, tracing the failure backward through layers of code most of the in-house engineers had never even thought to examine. At one point, he asked for nothing more than a cup of coffee and 20 minutes of silence, and the room, despite itself, gave him exactly that, without argument. When the lights finally flickered back to life across the production floor, a quiet cheer rose from workers, who had spent the entire day standing beside machines that refused to move. The specialists who had spent the previous day failing to find any solution at all, stood staring at the readouts in disbelief, slowly piecing together what they were actually looking at. The man everyone had treated as an afterthought was, by every measurable standard, a genuine technical genius, the kind of mind companies spent fortunes trying to recruit and almost never managed to find. Closer inspection of the failure's origin revealed something far more troubling than a simple mechanical fault. The shutdown had not been an accident at all. Evidence buried deep in the system logs traced the sabotage back to an account with access privileges that should never have existed. An account that led, through several careful layers of concealment, directly back to Damian Cross. The man who had tried to buy Ethan's silence and failed had instead chosen to burn down an entire factory's worth of production rather than accept that he had lost. Security footage, recovered during the same investigation, showed an unfamiliar technician entering a restricted server room 2 nights before the failure, wearing a contractor's badge that records later revealed had been issued under a false name. The trail led investigators to a shell company quietly funded through one of Damian's smaller holdings, sloppy enough in its construction that it took barely a day to unravel once anyone bothered to look closely. What had once seemed like an unsolvable mystery collapsed quickly into a straightforward case of corporate sabotage, motivated by nothing more than wounded pride and a refusal to lose gracefully. The exposure could not have come at a worse time for him, with Stonewell's shareholders already gathering for an emergency meeting that had originally been called to address an entirely different controversy. Word of the sabotage spread through the boardroom before the meeting had even officially begun, shifting the entire tone of the gathering from outrage at Victoria's personal life to outrage at the company that had nearly destroyed it from the inside. Inside that boardroom, the pressure on Victoria reached its breaking point. Senior shareholders, many of whom had spent weeks quietly maneuvering against her, presented her with an ultimatum framed as a simple business decision, dressed up in moral language. She could keep her position as the company's next chief executive, or she could keep the man from the gala. But the room made it clear, in no uncertain terms, that she could not have both. One older shareholder, a man who had sat on the board since before Victoria was born, leaned forward and reminded her, almost gently, that legacies took generations to build and only moments to lose. Another suggested that perhaps a quiet, dignified separation, followed by a carefully worded statement, could still salvage the company's reputation if she acted quickly enough. The room watched her with the kind of attention usually reserved for verdicts, certain they already knew which way ambition would eventually pull her. Victoria did not hesitate, not even for the length of a single breath. "I choose the man who saved my life," she said, her voice carrying easily across a room that had gone completely silent, waiting for her answer. For a moment, nothing happened, and the silence stretched long enough that some in the room assumed she had simply ended her own career with 11 words. Then, one by one, representatives from several of Stonewell's largest partner companies rose from their seats, each declaring, in turn, their continued confidence in Victoria's leadership and their support for the decision she had just made in front of everyone. The momentum in the room shifted entirely within minutes, the shareholders who had pushed the ultimatum suddenly finding themselves isolated rather than victorious. Evidence of Damien's sabotage, combined with the documented bribery attempt against Ethan, gave the board more than enough justification to act decisively against the very people who had tried to force Victoria's hand. Damien was removed from the building within the hour, facing charges that would follow him far longer than any business deal ever could have. By the meeting's end, Victoria's position as chief executive of Stonewell Industries had been confirmed unanimously. The opposition that had threatened her career just hours earlier scattered and discredited. As the room began to clear, she turned toward the back entrance where Ethan had been quietly waiting, and instead of simply rejoining him, she invited him forward, onto the stage, in front of cameras that had once mocked his second-hand suit. He hesitated only briefly before walking up to stand beside her, and for the first time since the night of the gala, he did not look like a man being dragged into a spotlight he never asked for. Victoria told the room everything then. The avalanche, the storm, the 3 days in a cabin with a stranger who never asked her name, and the 7 years she had spent afterward refusing to believe he simply did not exist. She described the necklace she had carried in every bag she owned since, the investigators she had hired and exhausted, and the quiet certainty that had kept her from ever fully committing to anyone else. By the time she finished speaking, the entire room had risen to its feet, applause rolling through the space in a way that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or shareholder confidence. Ethan stood beside her, visibly uncomfortable with the attention, and said the only thing that felt true enough to say out loud. "I never imagined helping a stranger could change the entire course of my life," he said. Victoria did not wait for him to say anything more. She knelt down in front of him, in front of everyone, and pulled the old, tarnished necklace from a small box she had carried with her that day for exactly this purpose. "Thank you," she said, "for saving me." This time, it was Ethan who closed the distance between them, and the kiss that followed had nothing rehearsed or accidental about it, only the quiet certainty of two people who had finally stopped running from something they had both wanted for a very long time. The room erupted, applause mixing with something closer to disbelief, the entire scandal of the gala finally resolving into the very thing it had always secretly been. A year passed quickly after that, the way important years often do once the dust finally settles. Victoria ran Stonewell Industries with the same sharp instincts she always had, though those who worked closely with her noticed she had grown gentler, less guarded, more willing to laugh in meetings that once would have been entirely transactional. Ethan, after months of quiet insistence and undeniable results, was named the company's Director of Technical Innovation, a position he earned entirely through proven ability, rather than the relationship everyone had once assumed would carry him there. Walter Higgins, the engineer who had first told Ethan's story to a skeptical press, joined the new division as a senior advisor, finally receiving the kind of recognition that had eluded both men for years. Claire, Victoria's longtime assistant, often joked that the office had become noticeably louder since Ethan started bringing his own coffee maker to work, refusing on principle to drink anything from the executive kitchen that cost more than his old monthly grocery budget. Reporters who once mocked his second-hand suit occasionally requested interviews now, hoping he might say something quotable about success. And he usually declined, preferring to let the work speak for itself the way it always had. Together, they founded a scholarship program aimed at skilled laborers and technicians who had never been given the chance to develop their talents the way the world had once almost denied Ethan his own. The program funded training, mentorship, and opportunities for people the industry routinely overlooked. Men and women who fixed things quietly and asked for nothing in return, exactly as Ethan once had. Within its first year, dozens of workers had already passed through programs the foundation sponsored, several going on to roles no one would have predicted for them a decade earlier. One young woman, a former line worker named Megan, who had never finished technical school for lack of money, became the program's first graduate to be promoted into a full engineering role at Stonewall itself. She told a small gathering at the foundation's anniversary dinner that she had almost given up entirely before hearing Ethan's story repeated on the news, the version where a poor man with nothing to offer turned out to be exactly the person an entire company desperately needed. Victoria watched Ethan's face during that speech and noticed, for the first time, that he allowed himself to look genuinely proud of something in public. On a quiet afternoon nearly identical in temperature to the one 7 years earlier, Victoria and Ethan returned together to the same mountain where everything between them had actually begun, long before either of them understood what that beginning would eventually become. The trail looked different now, gentler somehow. Though the cabin where he had once kept her alive through 3 days of brutal cold still stood at the edge of the clearing, weathered but intact. Sunset spread slowly across the valley below them, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose that neither of them bothered to photograph. Content simply to watch it happen, Victoria took his hand and smiled, the same smile that had once convinced a half-frozen stranger that surviving might actually be worth the effort. "Back then," she said, "I thought I was the one who got saved." Ethan tightened his grip on her hand, watching the last light fade gently over the ridge where he had once found her half buried in snow, certain she would not survive the night. "No," he said quietly. "That day, we found each other." They stood there a while longer, two figures silhouetted against a fading sky. The noise of boardrooms and headlines and 7 lost years finally settled into something quiet and complete behind them.